Spring 2003, a small group of special forces and CIA operatives must establish a second front to tie down the Iraqi army in the north to support the pending U.S.-led invasion in the south of Iraq. The mission sounds simple. The reality is anything but. Those Who Face Death is the incredible story of this little-known special operation and a testament to the courage, skill, and perseverance of U.S. Special Forces in the face of overwhelming odds. That is a back-of-the-book description of Those Who Face Death, the untold story of Special Forces and the Iraqi Kurdish resistance by Mark Grdovic, former Special Forces operator, strategist, and storyteller. Mark spent over 20 years in the U.S. Army. 19 of those years were in special operations. Now he is telling the story of his time with the Kurdish resistance in the early days of the Iraq War. I had a chance to read a early draft of Mark's book and provide notes on it, and I described it to the publisher as Mad Max meets Lord of the Rings. It is not your typical military war memoir, and I am so thrilled to have Mark here to talk about it today. Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie, and I'm a ghostwriter. I love a good story. I hope you enjoy this one. Mark, thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks, Charlie. It's my pleasure.
So you are, I believe, the third Green Beret we've had on this podcast, and if people want to go back and listen to, I forget the episode numbers. I'll put them in the show notes. We have Dave Fielding, who is around my age.
No,
you know him? Okay.
Absolutely.
And he wrote again a very unconventional book, and it was really about a lot of it was about what he went through at home. It was a great read, and if you haven't, I don't know if you've read it, but the cover is wild. He got a similar theme, really. He has it's like a Clint Eastwood movie, but with like an old Western, but like with an operator.
Yeah, he's great.
He's so cool. And Dan, I think is his name, who wrote Gray Zone Ethics. And I think he actually teaches in Tampa, if I'm not mistaken, but he was in Iraq as well. But they all had really interesting things to say about your line of work, and I'm going to ask you kind of the same question I asked them to kick things off. We have a fairly international audience on this podcast, and probably a wide range of opinions about America and America's military, et cetera. Can you tell us a little bit about what U.S. Special Forces, or Green Berets, I guess, as they're known? Like, what do you guys do, and how is that different from what people might think of when they think of the Army?
The best way to describe it is after World War II, the U.S. military and, the British military, for that matter, had a lot of experience in what I'm just going to call special operations. A lot of different organizations doing different things. So in U.S. military decided to formalize it, meaning like the stuff in World War II was done very quickly. It was done very well, but it was done very quickly. So the theory was, hey, why don't we actually create a specific organization like one of the organizations from World War II, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and we're going to call it Special Forces. So while there's a lot of different organizations, the Rangers, the Navy SEALs, we all sort of have slightly different niche specialties. The specialty for Special Forces is that they're designed to operate in small teams. Originally, it was designed for in enemy territory. That's why they're small, and they're somewhat self-sufficient. We don't do a lot of stuff in enemy territory as was envisioned in 1952, but because we're structured that way, we can, but we're also well suited to go to very remote and challenging places because we don't need a lot of support. All the members on the Special Forces team, it's a 12-man team, is the normal structure. They all have a secondary specialty. They're trained as medics, communicators, weapons specialists, engineers, intelligence specialist, operations specialist. That's how they're able to function sort of semi-independently. Having said that, though, the intent is that we would work with local indigenous forces, whether it's a resistance movement or the local counterinsurgency forces. And as I mentioned in the book, the motto of Special Forces, it's not about our lethality. It's actually, del oppresse liber, which is Latin to free the oppressed. So there's still that sort of mindset of we're here to help the local population. As compared to hanging our hat on, hey, we're the most lethal force or we're the most dangerous. The force is very lethal, but that's not its hallmark.
Speaking of liberating, I've got to let the cat out for 1 second. He is the most lethal force in our house. And so what you're describing when you say like a 12-man team, it could essentially be 12 of you and then thousands of local forces.
Yeah, theoretically. Yeah, that's and we would refer to that as it's a false force multiplier. The value is not just the 12 guys, it's the value is the 12 guys can enable a much larger, organization.
What was your specialty?
I was an officer, so I was trained, generically in all the skills, and then in sort of special officer skills to just understand how to lead a team.
And part part of the skill set that you guys have, from what I understand, or the way you described in the book, you're also really good teachers in a sense.
That's a big part of it. Like, yeah, we have to be able to train, teaching or training people and then advising them as well if the requirement calls for that. And to do that, it's a very unique skill set, because it's not just you need to be really competent. You need to know how to interact with a counterpart that might have a lot of really unusual challenges in their country that are not the same as what you would experience in, say, the United States. Theoretically, we're all trained in language skills. I was trained as a Russian speaker, which didn't really play into the story in the book. That's why I say it that way. Is like we all go to language training, but that doesn't, we're not stuck in, hey, we only can operate in that place with that language. Like, more often than not, what happens is someone on the team, coincidentally speaks Greek, or they coincidentally speak German. That's not the language they were trained in. They just happen to also speak that. And in the book, the Kurds we're dealing with, one of them speaks Greek. So that's how we communicate. But it's more than just language skills. It's cultural understanding, cultural appreciation, an interest in working with other cultures. That's an important part of the skill set.
And, if we're working in stereotypes here, I think an unfortunate one, and part of it's not even our fault, because America is a huge country. You could spend the rest of your life traveling around America and never really have to leave. But we're known for kind of oftentimes being a little bit insensitive of other cultures. And
yeah, completely accurate.
And it's interesting. Like, those are, I think, maybe it's kind of a leading question, but I think it might be interesting for listeners who might not think that cultural sensitivity and like military operations could go together.
I don't want to put too much emphasis on the word sensitivity, but like when we recruit and train our force, our individuals, part of our selection in that process is identifying people who are interested in this versus, hey, I want to just be a special operator because I want to be, super lethal. That's fine. That's a slightly different thing. We put a tremendous amount of emphasis on, hey, you're going to work with other cultures and other countries and other team members. You have to be interested in doing that. And then you also have to be interested in learning how to do that effectively. You can't just connect with a foreign entity and like insist they do it our way, or, think you're going to dominate them by telling them, hey, we're the United States. Like, it's a partnership. In most cases, it's a partnership. And there's a nuance and negotiation style to that to find that common ground. And that takes a lot of skill.
And when you think of like how you train that, and I don't want to go overly into training because I know there's elements of it you probably can't talk about. And I got the impression from Dave, there are things where it's almost like you don't want to spoil the surprise for people who might go down that pipeline of training. But I remember seeing something maybe on the Discovery Channel, and it was like special forces, and they were doing a scenario where you had to go meet with some kind of a tribal elder or something, but it's like you were everyone in this was like tired and exhausted, and then they had to like stay up all night singing drinking songs or whatever.
Yeah, so everybody in Special Forces knows in the Special Forces course, the culminating event exercise is called Robin Sage. That's the name of the exercise, and it's in a simulated fictitious country called Pineland. There's a lot of pine trees in North Carolina. And it's very, very elaborate. I mean, when you're in the course, you'll spend 6 months getting fake news clips, fake intelligence reports, like preparing you for, in 6 months, we're going to war in Pineland. So like when the time comes to infiltrate into Pineland, you have been thinking about the political situation in Pineland for 6 months and the challenges they're facing and the instability, all the different sides, and then you go into it. And it's not just like a military training area. It's actually conducted all over North Carolina. Almost none of it is on a military training installation. And there's hundreds of role players that are very elaborate. Some are your resistance counterparts, the resistance of Pineland. Some of them are just local civilians. And it's deliberately overwhelming for the students to have to deal with this complicated, messy, not black and white situation. And all the role players, it's very controlled, that the role players know exactly what they're doing. They're going to throw challenging dilemmas at the students where they literally have to think. I was actually an instructor twice at the Special Forces course. I used to train officers. And the simplest way to explain it, how you train somebody for that, think of your brain as like being gears in a machine. Literally, once I just get I'm going to call it the rust to break and the gears start to turn, that you get a sense of, I need you to think. It's not a book answer. It's not a black and white answer. I need you to do the best you can, evaluate what you see, and pick what you think is the best option. And if it's not the best option, we're going to continue to go with it and try to make it as good of an option as we can. Because like people will have a tendency to sort of shut down. And that's literally what we're training our guys in our special forces course to do, is do not shut down. Continue to mentally engage and think about the problem. And we every special forces guy will joke about Pineland, his time back in Pineland and back in Robin Sage, because it is a fundamental experience we all have.
And I mean, and I guess part of what you're being prepared for is like, while you might have all these really specialized skills that are taught by some of the best people and you have access to all this technology, you might be working with people who don't even have military training, right? They're just
100%.
They're just brave and they don't want to live under a dictator and they have a few guns or whatever.
And it's funny because I will say, special forces guys, we all joke about this, that, hey, Robin Sage was a great experience, but it wasn't particularly realistic. We don't expect we're actually going to go do that in the real world. The experience that I have, that I captured in the book, is exactly, it's uncanny how similar to Robin Sage it was. Like the things you talked about where we've been awake for 48 hours, and and this is an event that we all know about, like meeting the guerrilla chief. We're physically exhausted. We've been infiltrating for a day. We finally get there. Now it's time to have our first meeting with our new counterpart. And we are now going to meet each other. We're going to talk about our objectives. It's a very important meeting, and I distinctly remember the experience in the book, like how I was stunned. This is exactly like everything I went through in Robin Sage.
And even, I mean, I'm thinking of just travel experiences. You don't have to go far to, like, you go to Ireland or England, you don't say no to a cup of tea, right?
Yeah.
Like little things like that where you could be rude without even realizing it.
Yeah, and it's a good point. Like you say that from your own experience traveling, it's the same thing. Like if you've been doing this a little while, and hopefully there's some older guys on the team with more experience that mentor the younger guys, there's just things you learn over time, the right way to do things, the better way to do things. And you talk about possibly dealing with people who don't have military experience. Again, this is a special forces uniquism where, because of what we're trained to do in this scenario, like say, well, I'm going to use the term irregular forces. We're working with resistance forces. So we have an idea in our head. We're going to enable our counterpart to conduct combat operations. And then you meet your counterpart and you find out, and this could be Ukraine this year. You meet your fighting force and you find out this guy was a school teacher, this person was a truck driver, this person is a housewife, and you realize, like, this is not as simple as, here's your military unit, go do great military things. You realize these are people, maybe this guy volunteered. Maybe this person was just trapped here and this is what they're doing now. Like they didn't wake up one day and mentally say, I'm going to go be a resistance fighter. And that's super challenging.
Well, there was one scene in your book that really stuck out at me. And this is where I get the Mad Max side of it. And I have some more questions later about how, like, it seems like you had some unique challenges, but you also were out of certain types of danger that might, if you were in a convoy or something, you would have to deal with. But you borrowed some old lady's car to get to the front line.
So throughout the story, there's a series of challenges we face that are all fairly monumental, frankly, and we're able to navigate our way, and adapt and overcome those challenges. And one of the challenges we faced that was quite overwhelming was we had anticipated staging and infiltrating into northern Iraq from Turkey. And Turkey quickly changed their position and wanted to be neutral and said they're not going to participate in the war. All of our equipment had been funneled to Turkey over the previous 6 to 3 months. So all of our vehicles, all of our heavy equipment was all sitting on an airbase in Turkey that we couldn't access. So there's another crazy part of the story that we can talk about if you want, that we eventually did get the force into Iraq. We bypassed Turkey, which is a pretty crazy story in itself. But now we're on the ground and the only equipment we have are our rucksacks, which is fine, but that's a bit much. So it was difficult for us to get around. So our Kurdish counterparts were able to turn to each other and say, who has a car that they can lend us? So I've got 15 special forces teams that I'm trying to coordinate their efforts. When they infiltrated, basically I'm handing them, like, here's the keys to a dump truck, here's the keys to a small bus, and here's the keys to a family car. That is now your team's vehicles. And frankly, in that scenario too, I'm like, hey, and the drivers don't speak English, but there was an English speaker here earlier today. I had him translate to the drivers. They know where to take you. They're going to now take you to go meet your guerrilla chief 2 hours away from here, 3 hours away from here. What are your questions? And the teams were great. The teams were like, okay. And they'd load up in their their ragtag convoy of very odd vehicles. And the point you're getting at is, as there's a picture in my head, as one of the guys is handing me the keys saying, here's the car we got you. Please bring this back. It's my mother-in-law's car.
That was it.
And I'm like, I'll do my best. And if you recall, probably a month later, 2 weeks to a month later, one of the teams comes back to me and says, hey, we got some really bad news. And I said, what's up? And it was the team leader. And he says, we took a lot of Iraqi artillery today. And I mean, in that point in my life where combat was still somewhat of a novelty, he's like, we had about 60 rounds of Iraqi artillery shell us today. And that's a pretty significant event. I was just glad to hear they were all alive. But he goes, the car got stuck in a field and we couldn't get it. And I'm like, I'll deal with the car. I'm just glad you guys are alive. But yeah, the book's filled with very odd, unexpected stories like that. Because as you pointed out, we're dealing with a very, very human dynamic. This is very personal. All of it is.
Well, and I want to get into, because I mean, again, that's where it really gets heavy at some points, the personal side of it. I want to get there. But one thing that kind of has to be said, especially probably in people's, again, with people's like mental image of the Iraq war, at this point, you are not even the strongest military in Iraq. Like, you were this little force standing up to what at the time, Saddam Hussein had a real army.
Yeah. This is an important point, particularly for U.S. military audiences to understand the history of this. There's a weird explanation why, but when the United States was making the decisions to do this, to invade Iraq, for whatever reason, right or wrong, they chose to do it with a smaller invasion force than has ever been used, at least in U.S. military history. By comparison, the size of the force was minuscule. To give you a comparison, when we liberated Kuwait during the Gulf War of 1990, we had roughly 20 divisions, and the division is anywhere from 12 to 15,000 soldiers. We had 20 divisions as the coalition to liberate Kuwait. Going into Iraq, the U.S. plan is we're going to do it with 7 divisions. And Iraq is about 25 times the size of Kuwait. So is a really weird mismatch. So the U.S. military was of the impression that technology has improved so much, we can do this with a very light and fast force. That was I'll say it's either a bad decision or a very bold decision. But so now, in my perspective, I get tasked to create a second front to tie up as much of the Iraqi army north of Baghdad as possible. And 60% of Saddam Hussein's army is north of Baghdad. So it's my mission to keep them up there to give the invasion in the south a better chance. And that just gives you a little bit of context. So yeah, Saddam has a fairly capable and large army. They have old, outdated equipment, but they're very experienced. I spent so much time studying the maps and the Iraqi strategy that I started to understand. Like, I really felt like it started to pop out like three-dimensional. I could feel, I know what they're trying to do. And I think the intent was, okay, the United States is very powerful. They're going to cross into Iraq, and it's going to be a very bloody fight for the Iraqi forces. So I kind of get the impression they pushed some of their elite forces and then some of their lesser forces to meet the initial American wave, if you will. And I suspect Saddam's idea was he's going to create some kind of mass casualty event for the Americans. The Americans will lose their stomach for this, will stall somewhere, hopefully south of Baghdad or in Baghdad, and then he can then sue for a ceasefire or peace with the remaining army he has and the remaining but smaller free Iraq, if you will. So theoretically, he'll still be in charge of Iraq. It'll just be a smaller Iraq, and then he can negotiate for peace and getting his territory back. I mean, frankly, that's actually a pretty good strategy. At least that's my impression of what his plan was.
I was surprised to learn, I read the book, They Will Have to Die Now, and it's basically a history of Mosul, starting with the beginning of time, and then it focuses mainly on the ISIS insurgency. I didn't realize how much time he had on his hands between the Gulf War and ultimately being toppled. Did you know he wrote novels, Saddam Hussein?
That I did not know.
Apparently they're weird. They're like kind of...
I'm not surprised.
You'd assume they would be weird, right? But they're like, there's like a romance side of it, and there's like a prince who kind of has to save the day and save Iraq, and they're like this weird mix of like nationalism and romance. And
I did not know that, but I can picture that. because Saddam liked to paint himself as like everything, like the celebrity, the hero, the icon for Iraq. So I get because like when you travel around, you'd see murals of him in every town, and like if it's a Kurdish town, and you don't see this in the free Kurdish areas, but like if it's a Kurdish town, he will be dressed in Kurdish clothing. If you go 40 miles down the road and it's an Arab town, he'll be dressed in Arab clothing. So like he was very much about trying to be like a celebrity and a hero for everybody.
And some of that artwork, I follow this Instagram account that it's propaganda posters through history, and they're really his are almost like psychedelic. Like he's on a unicorn in some of them, and
that's right. That's what I mean. Like I don't mean like he's really great. That's not what I mean. But like he's definitely trying to portray himself as he is the hero for everybody.
Sure.
You know, and it's actually it's particularly creepy because it would be creepy normally if somebody did that, but now you're doing it in a place where you just massacred many of the people in this town. Like the genocide has been conducted in this town, and then you were like, what would be good here? A poster of me riding a winged horse. The people would love
right.
that. But that explains Saddam's mindset very, very well.
Hmm. Going back to maps real quick, there's something that I really liked when I was kind of refreshing my memory to get ready for this podcast. You've actually added maps to your website as bonus content for the book.
For me, maps are always an important part of the book. I will say I'll sometimes judge a military book by its maps because I want to be able to follow the story. So I knew maps was a very important part of my story. Spent a lot of time. I think there's 11 maps. And then the question was, hey, for the audiobook, how are we going to do this? And that was immediately it was an easy decision for me. Like I want to post those on a homepage for, that people can download at any time. So the pictures, the maps, and the back of the book has like sort of lessons of the operation. That's all available, for free essentially on the homepage.
And when you think about like the geography and the history of where you are, one thing I kept thinking of, I mean, like the other analogy is kind of like Lawrence of Arabia. I mean, you were doing a job quite similar to his in the place where he essentially invented your job description.
Yeah. And if anybody's like, if you have a good familiarity with the history of Lawrence and what he did, there is a tie to Iraq through King Faisal and the establishment of, the Arab state, which was predominantly in Jordan, but it bleeds over into the Iraqi territory. I'm somewhat of a history buff. I'm also somewhat of an archaeology buff. Like that, I just find those things interesting. And I think it comes out. I was talking to an Iraqi friend of mine yesterday. I think I let that clear in the book that I'm fascinated with Iraq. It's an incredible country for archaeology and history. So like not just in sense of Lawrence, but where we were fighting up north is where Alexander the Great fought Darius. It's actually between Erbil and Mosul is the area where it's the famous Battle of Gargamella. For everybody who's like, oh yeah, I always wondered where that was. But there's so much history. The Mongols came through there, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Mesopotamians, Nebuchadnezzar. There's so much history packed into that one area. And besides, like, there were moments where I paused and thought, 3,000 years ago, Alexander came rolling right through here. If you recall, there's a couple of scenes where I'm talking about I'm standing on a hilltop during one of the particularly big battles by the Iraqi Iran-Iraq border. And it's a hilltop. It's not a hilltop. It's a man-made hilltop. It's a fortified position, but it's about 300 feet tall. And they're called Gordis. That's the Kurdish term for these mounds. There's one of them like every 5 kilometers. They're defensive positions. They were built sometime 300, 400, 500 years ago. And they're all man-made to overlook the flat plains that are in front of the foothills and then the giant mountains. And like I'm doing stuff and I'm standing on this hilltop, but then I'm thinking, I'm like, this was built a tremendously long time ago to defend this frontier from the Mongols, from the Persians. And that was never lost on me because it really is fascinating. Like you mentioned Mosul. Mosul is Nineveh, the ancient city of Nineveh. Mm-hmm. The biblical home of Jonah, from Jonah and the whale. Kirkuk, the city that I was most involved with, there's a burial site there. And as we're driving around Kirkuk, I asked my counterparts, what's that? And they said that's where Daniel is buried. Daniel of the Lion's Den. It's kind of fascinating because from them, they don't see that as a Jewish Christian. They're like, it's just he's a prophet because apparently if you can go into a ring and like make the lion sit down, that's something noteworthy that people remember. So like Daniel is a prominent figure in that part of the world.
Wow.
There's so much history like that there. It's incredible.
I mean, there was a line in that book about Mosul that made me just like, it's kind of stopped me in my tracks, and I just sat there, even though it's kind of an obvious observation. But it was, Iraq is the only place in the world where a student can learn to read and write in the place that invented reading and writing.
Yeah, that's a great quote, and very accurate.
It's yeah, no, it's really, and there's that, I mean, there's that famous monologue that one of the British officers going into Iraq gave to basically like tread softly, because he was, I don't know the exact words, but basically he was trying to impress upon his guys the importance and beauty and history of that place.
Yeah.
And that gets back to kind of what I found really the heart of your book was this time you spent in Iraq with Iraqis, connecting with them in a way that, I mean, it seemed, and we'll get to kind of the heartbreaking side of that, but that must have made a real impression on you.
It did. And to expand for listeners that might, fully grasp what you're talking about. So like, obviously this operation, it was very personal. We're completely mixed in with local forces. And that's a really fascinating piece. But like, one of the dynamics that I took away from it, I'm very glad this was my experience, in terms of, hey, we all get to do different things in the military. We don't know what it's going to be. This for me worked out. I'm very, very proud of this experience, at least from but in the earlier phases of the book, from the Kurdish perspective, we are liberating them. We are helping them liberate themselves from the oppression of Saddam Hussein. And again, for people who may not be historically familiar, because we're getting a little bit farther away from that era, a young kid at a conference the other day asked me, hey, this Saddam guy, was he really bad? And I dawned on him, I'm like, in his adult life, he has never even heard of Saddam Hussein, which in my younger adult life, it was, in the news every week. When you spend time in a community that has experienced that degree of dictatorship-like oppression, genocide, massacres, whatever you want to call it, there's you and I were talking a little bit before we started recording this, there's like a societal trauma that's ever present. You can literally feel it, because every single person you're talking to has had a loved one killed. Whether it was my husband, my wife, my son, my daughter, my cousin, my brother, my sister, every single one of them. And it's probably not one, it's probably significant multiples that they have had people who have been taken away and killed, executed, buried in mass graves, tortured, disappeared. That's a common experience in this particular culture. And it's interesting because you can be meeting someone and dealing with them, and everything's super happy and it's really great, and you're thinking it's going along well, and then something will trigger them, and then it makes you realize, oh my gosh, the things they've had to deal with. And it can change from the mood. It's not like a hostility, but the mood can change from extremely jovial, we've got great food on the table, we're having a good time, and then someone will talk about the time that those guys were killed, and the mood changes immediately to ultra serious. And then 2 seconds later, we're going to go back to laughing and joking about something else. And as a visitor, in that culture, it's very evident this is what it's like to live under oppression. And as a military guy, it's kind of amusing because when you leave that, it stays with you. Like when you go home, that experience stays with you. So, and I don't mean to make light of this, but like when the military is like, hey, we're going to give you a medal for what you did, you do kind of feel like this is goofy because I spent blank months with those people and I'm getting a medal. None of them get a medal, and they did the same things. They did a lot more than I did. And you appreciate the medal, like, hey, the military is doing the best they can to acknowledge whatever you did, but you're less about getting a medal for yourself and more about realizing I'm very glad we did help those people. We did help the Kurds liberate themselves. As goofy or as messy as Iraq did continue to get down the road, it's still better off without Saddam Hussein.
Things that seems to be part of the history of your community, in that, and the big one that comes to mind would be Vietnam. There were cases of, in a war that was fraught and controversial, there were cases of really doing the right thing or doing right by a group that has otherwise been totally overlooked by history. I think of like the Montagnards in Vietnam.
Yeah, it's a perfect example. Like the relationship between the special forces in Vietnam and the local Montagnard tribesmen. There's a reason there's thousands of Montagnard families living in North Carolina today, because their relationship was so close and so tight. There's also a large Montagnard community in California for that same reason. And unfortunately, the war was very sloppy and messy and didn't end well at all. But the things that the guys did particularly along the border with the Montagnards was actually really, really, really good. And it's in line with that same idea that you talked about.
And those were, and again, that's a whole other history tangent. But I mean, those were people who were sort of discriminated against and discarded kind of by both sides,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's from a Vietnam perspective, that was the challenge, that the country that we were supporting, South Vietnam, also didn't care for the Montagnards. And that was always problematic at its core.
Mm. This might be a weird one, and maybe you didn't think about it this way, but I have to imagine it would be strange to go from an environment like that, where so much of your experience is shaped by these people who have had to endure something that's just beyond what most of us can understand. And then you can come back to like a very comfortable life in the United States, and you might be at Starbucks, and someone's complaining that there's too much
It's
ice
weird.
in their iced coffee. Is that weird?
It's super weird. And I'll share an anecdote with you. When I left country, I exfiltrated out through. We left Iraq, and I flew to Romania to go home. And we stopped in Romania for like a night, and it was me and like say six of my guys, six NCOs that I know very very well. I've known these guys for a really long time. We're Special Forces is a slightly closer knit community than the regular Army because everybody's a little bit older. Like nothing against the regular Army, but their structure is a little bit more rigid. Where we're a little bit slightly different in that regard. But so we're traveling, and we stopped in Romania. It's now a U.S. Air Force run airfield, and when we got off, they directed us to go off to the side. And I just remember this is weird to explain, but it makes no sense. And I said to the guys with me, I was like, "Is anybody else feel on edge right now?" And everybody agreed, like, I don't feel right. And like we just felt like if anybody comes up to us and says, "Hey, you guys can't walk on the grass there," or whatever, we all felt like we were going to lose it. And we acknowledged that our emotional state was not normal. And we went to dinner. We very deliberately went off and sat by ourselves at the coast. It's a big lake, Lake Constanta. And we just sat there and we all had like a beer and just kind of defused. And we all we talked about it. We acknowledged like it's really weird the way I feel. I feel out of place in this environment. And like I'll say that wore off in a couple of days, but it caught me off guard how almost emotionally sensitive we all felt going back to a completely normal environment.
Mm.
There was also, I'll say this too, there was also guilt might be a strong word, but there was a frustration that the Special Forces guys felt we were leaving before we were finished. And we were frustrated. Subsequently, most of us ended up going back in a few months because things started to devolve quickly. But that was almost our point. Like we felt like suddenly there was a shift in focus to we got to get everybody home versus what are we doing here? Like the focus was supposed to be on finishing our mission. I sometimes equate it to a baseball or any sports analogy that like it was the ninth inning baseball and we were really winning by a lot and we were so excited with our superior score that we chose to walk off the field. And then we're confused months later when we're losing.
When I think about your book, the thing that stuck with me, and I remember reading it, getting very emotional, when you kind of had to say goodbye and leave these people.
Yeah. There's a couple of points like that in the book. When I found out I was going home, and when we all knew like we're going home in a week, we're going home in 2 weeks, but I was told, hey, the plane's coming in today. You need to leave today. I didn't have a chance to say goodbye to the primary counterpart, the Kurdish counterpart that I had been working with routinely. And he had gotten like food poisoning. So which is kind of a common event every couple of months. And he was out. So I ended up writing him a fairly long letter, trying to give him as much advice to help them going forward as possible. And I left it for him. And that was difficult because again, there was this, I feel like we're rushing out of here. We're not leaving on good terms. And actually, I don't think I talked about this in the book. When I did leave, the rest of the Kurdish leadership that was present as we're saying goodbye, they presented me and the other officer in the book, Lieutenant Colonel Tovo, who's now Lieutenant General retired Tovo. They presented us with gifts. And the gifts they gave us were hand-carved chess sets. And there's a couple of things that are cool about that. One, depending on the different stories, chess was originated from Iran, which northern Iraq culturally is very similar to some parts of Iran. So like it's somewhat like loosely Persia. So they're giving us a chess set that's sort of culturally from the area. But we talked about chess quite a bit. I'm not a great chess player, but I love the history of where chess comes from. And there were times when they asked us, well, I don't understand the American strategy. And we made smart ass comments like, well, the Americans are playing checkers. You guys are playing chess. And they didn't know what checkers was. And we described checkers to them and they were like, that sounds like a kid's game.
Right.
So
That is the analogy. That's the
yeah,
point.
so them giving us a chess was cool, but it was also a little bit symbolic.
It strikes me the way you describe this culture, it almost sounds like a sort of hospitality that would nearly put you to shame.
Going back to the special forces training, the course, the role player counterparts you have are terrible. They're difficult to work with. They're problematic. They're doing all sorts of unsavory things. They're working with the black market. They're committing human rights or violations. So, like, as a trainee or a student, you have to deal with all this stuff, and they suck at fighting too. That's the part that wasn't real. That wasn't my experience with these guys. The Kurds could not have been better partners. Like, when we linked up with them, when we met with them, Kurds notoriously are mountain people. Like, that's the Kurdish identity. We from 10th Special Forces Group, my unit, of all the special forces units, we sort of have a mountain personality. The organization's from Colorado. We spend a lot of time, in the mountains. So we kind of have a mountain personality. So immediately there was a rapport with that. They're great fighters. There's no issue with them fighting. They're great fighters. Their food is great. Because like that's another schoolhouseism. Like, we'll present some very bizarre local dish that we know is disgusting, and we want to see if you're going to be polite and try it, or if you're going to be like, oh my God, we didn't experience any of that. The Kurdish food's fantastic. So culturally, it was too easy because they were too easy to get along with. And then subsequently also, before we started this, we sort of made an effort to make sure, do we have the same objectives? Do we have the same ideology? And we did. Actually, that's worth explaining for a second, because it would be very easy to rush into a scenario and say, hey, we found some indigenous forces that we think we could work with that will meet our objectives. But have we asked the question, well, what are they going to want to do once we achieve our objectives? Are they going to want to run the country? Are they going to want to go kill the other ethnic group that they don't like? We didn't experience any of that with the Kurds. They could not have been better partners. So that actually was a great pleasure. Now, I'll also say this: in Special Forces, we have a saying, go with the natives, don't go native. And this is part of the professional training. When you work with somebody for a long time, you're going to develop a bias for them. And I'll say straight up, yeah, I did with the Kurds. I absolutely love the Kurds. But you always have to keep it in the back of your mind that, hey, you're getting one picture of the story. Like, when we talked a little bit about Bosnia, we had a lot of teams that worked in Bosnia for a long time. And traditionally, teams that worked with the Bosnians felt the Bosnians were more the victims. Teams that worked with the Serbians after 6 months or a year felt the Serbians were the victims. So there's always that dynamic that you have to professionally be aware of. But having said that, I'm a super fan of the Kurdish people, because I think they're just fantastic.
Remember the writer Christopher Hitchens wore a pin of the Peshmerga on his lapel through his whole career. I've heard nothing but good things. Have you been back?
Well, yeah, I went back to Iraq in 2007 and 8, and then a couple of shorter trips in like 2010 and 11. I did get to go up to Erbil a couple of times, which is weird going back, because it's now, it's got, at that time, not now, but it had a whole bunch of other U.S. military buildup infrastructure, which was totally foreign to me. Like, when I was there, it looked like it was Iraq. When I went back years later, it was American military occupation of Iraq, and it was very, very different.
Mm. And I guess it has to be said, I mean, a lot of these folks would have family in Europe. You could, in theory, you could drive to Turkey, like you were saying.
Yeah, it's in 2003, as things were going well for us and wrapping up. A lot of the Kurds, I was actually sitting in some mountain cafe, if you will, having a cup of tea, and it was beautiful. The Kurdish mountains, by the way, are also the northern Iraqi mountains. It's the Rocky Mountain National Park. It's incredibly beautiful. And they're like, oh, you should come back and bring your family. And there's a part of my brain, and I'm like, I would be up for that. I don't think my wife would be up for this. But having said that, you talk about like maintaining relationships. The leader of the Kurdish faction we worked with, the leader of the PUK, was a man named Jalal Talabani. He passed away, I want to say, in 2009 or 10. Myself and the other individual in the book, Lieutenant Colonel Tovo, and we had both been promoted and moved on in our military careers. We made a point to write letters to Bafel Talabani, the son of Jalal, and Bafel was the individual that was my main counterpart that I missed getting to say goodbye to. I corresponded with him a couple of times over the years, but like, we both wrote condolence letters, and we gave them to American couriers inside Iraq to get to them, to just, to still show our condolence. Like, it wasn't just, hey, we worked with you, we're done with you. This was a real thing. And I will say, Bothell is the head of the Kurdish regional government right now. And I know where he is and how to get hold of him. I'm actually going to send him a book soon because I haven't had a chance to do that.
That was my next question, and it sounds like
Yeah.
he needs a book.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I remember listening to, I wish I could remember the name of the book, but I was listening to a podcast where a guy who had been, I believe he was MacSog V, or MacV-SOG, whatever that acronym was. And he had a chance, he visited Vietnam and had a chance to give Jap, or one of the top, he gave him a book, which I guess he put in a place of honor with his Marx and Lenin.
General Giab is an interesting character because he's a very, very smart, famous individual, very, very smart, very good strategist. What I know of him and the conversations I've heard him and a handful of Americans have had, and it's that kind of conversation you can have years after a war with an adversary, that if you respect each other as professionals, as I think he was, that we can talk about what we did. What did you think? I can totally picture that with him.
And that actually is something I completely forgot to even ask about. And I hope I'm not getting this wrong and conflating this with a different book or something. But I believe, because we've so far talked about allies, but there was an issue with it, like one of Saddam's generals was essentially trying to surrender and join forces with the U.S.
Yeah, if it's the story, I think it was. And this is weird because I was literally just telling somebody this story the other day, and I don't know if it was in the book. Would this be the one where we went to a house of an Iraqi family to tell them their son had been killed in fighting? If it's the story I'm thinking of. But there's a lot of stories like this, but this is a very personal human story. So later in the book, in the epilogue, I talk about the counterinsurgency here, just briefly, because I felt like that was an important piece to the story, where now we were working, is very, very different scenario. We're working with all sorts of Iraqi forces in every single town and province, building up counterinsurgency forces that we called Iraqi SWAT units. And as a point, we have a very, very tight relationship with those guys that we trained, we raised them, we advised them, we fought alongside them. It's a real legitimate relationship as partners. When an Iraqi soldier was killed, the team goes to the family's house the same way you would do it with an American, to notify the family of the terrible, terrible news. So the family's distraught, as you can imagine. And the family sees that the team members, the Americans and the Iraqis that are there, are also very distraught. This is not just some, administrative, we had to notify you. And, unfortunately, I could say this from a few experiences. Like when you see a handful of Green Berets crying, it's an emotional event. Like it throws you off to see people that tough, breaking down crying. But so the guys are tearing up, if not crying, at this family's house. So the father then wants to know, tell me more about how my son died, because he wants to kind of know, like, did my son die fighting? Was he a good soldier? And the true story, the team is like, yeah, he was a fantastic soldier. We loved him. He actually died, protecting some of us, saving us, for whatever small consolation that is for the family or for the father. Like, your son was a great warrior and he was a great patriot for Iraq. So the father then excuses himself and goes in the back room. He comes back a few minutes later with his old Iraqi uniform, and he sort of makes a gesture that he wants to surrender, because he assumes that we were looking for all of the former Saddam regime leaders, which we were not. He's not somebody we were aware of and we're looking for. But it's really crazy because he wants to surrender, and the team's like, we're not. There's no warrant for your arrest or anything like that. So he's relieved but kind of surprised. So then he says to the team, my son trusted you. I want to help you now. What can I do to help you? And this is a very human dynamic thing where the team's very excited to get his help, because what you quickly find out is, particularly someone of his status in the community, they know who all the bad people are. Like, it's not a tricky secret. Like, they know exactly who they all are. And, if you're an outsider American that doesn't understand the dynamic of this, you might be like, struggling. How is this possible? And they're like, how is it not possible? Like, of course we know who in that house, they're hiding in the basement. In that house, it's one of my former subordinates that is fighting with the insurgency. So this becomes a huge success story for that particular team. And this kind of story, different variety, is happening in every single city. And the way I was explaining this story, that this is the key to this kind of fighting. There's an enemy and there's you. Both sides are going to be trying to convince the population our cause is better. The side that does a better job convincing the population, they're the one that wins. It's that simple. Because the population knows what's going on. They know where the bad people are. They know about everything. I was telling a similar story the other day. In this environment, special forces teams will often live in houses in the city. To the regular military, this is insane. Like they can't fathom how you could do it. How can you survive? Now, granted, we'll have fences and lights and cameras and all that security stuff, and we'll also have like a local security guard, maybe 20 guys that we've raised over time that are security. But the thing that keeps the team alive is, they buy their food from the local market. Like, let's say these are real examples. They buy eggs from a guy who sells eggs. That guy now makes $5 a week selling eggs to the Americans. And over time, he was glad to be making $5 a week, but he also got to know the Americans, and they're not what he thought. They seem like pretty good guys. Maybe they speak Arabic, even better. And now that he's been doing this for several months, when he hears we're going to attack the Americans tomorrow night, he slips a note in the next delivery of eggs that, hey, you guys are going to get attacked tomorrow at 12 o'clock. Like, that's common. That's common practice. And, well, we got a note from the egg guy. We also got a phone call from, this other person that works with us that said the same thing. And that's how you survive in an environment like that. It's not physical survival with fences and barbed wire. It's the population likes us. They don't want us to be killed. They want the enemy to be killed. And if it wasn't that case, they wouldn't have warned us and we'd get attacked and it would go very badly for us. I don't know if that was, I'm not sure.
That's brilliant. And it kind of seems to confirm something I'm an outdoors person. I read every book about survival and adventure and misadventure. And there's Mel Brooks, the director, his son wrote World War Z, which was that zombie movie a few years ago. And he wrote the Zombie Survival Guide, which is hilarious. It's actually full of like really practical, like disaster preparedness advice. It's just through the lens of what if zombies were. But he's kind of that kind of optimistic mindset that like the human fabric of our society isn't like, we're not going to break down into law of the jungle in a end of the world scenario. What'll happen is like human connection is going to be what saves us, because humans have survived when they band together and work together, as opposed to this, like, I need my personal arsenal in my basement because I'm not going to be able to trust my neighbors. And this seems to speak to that a little bit, that your armor was your connection to the community after a while.
Well, so
I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, absolutely. Let me give you an anecdote now, going back to Heinland, the Special Forces course, to give you a perspective. You'll see the parallels here. So in Pineland, the student Special Forces team is hiding in the woods over there outside. It's next to a guy's farm, and they're hiding there with their guerrilla force, right? This is part of the exercise. And from Fort Bragg, the 82nd Airborne has been tasked to be what we call the opposing force, the enemy. They're supposed to go to that patch of woods and attack the guerrilla force. Like that's the training event for today. And as I said, this is not on Fort Bragg. This is in North Carolina proper. So the 82nd Airborne guys get on trucks, and they now have to drive an hour and a half to the training place. And this is the parallels to the real world are incredible. They're not getting it. They think that like the drive from Fort Bragg to the training area doesn't count. That the training is going to start when they get off the trucks. So they stop short of the training location. They get out, they stretch their legs, and there's a gas station, and they say, hey, if everybody wants to just go grab a soda and a bag of chips, go in the gas station and, buy some stuff. So they go in there, and the local shop gas station owner starts just talking them up. Hey, what are you guys doing out here? And this is really weird, because I'm sure the guy really is actually, Americanly patriotic, but he's also locally from that area. So when he asks what they're doing here, they give it all up. They're like, oh, we're doing some training. We're going to, go attack some forces. And this guy is not scripted. This is all real. The guy plays it up like he doesn't know anything about what they're talking about, tells them how awesome they are. My cousin's in the 82nd Airborne, total lie. And he's like, I love you guys. This is great. So they think that, this patriotic American just patted him on the back. It's really cool. Let's get on the trucks, guys. We got to go. As soon as they get on the trucks and leave, this guy knows things. And he's like, hey, I think my friend is still working with those Special Forces guy. He gets on his phone and calls the barn owner, if you will. And he's, I'm using the names. He's like, hey, Tom, are you still working with them Special Forces guys? And Tom's like, yeah, they're out in my woods now. And he's like, hey, tell them there's a force coming to attack them in a few minutes. So the barn owner literally then runs down the hill and warns the American Special Forces team that the 82nd Airborne's coming, to which now they go and set up an ambush for the 82nd Airborne. The 82nd Airborne parks their trucks. As soon as they get off their trucks, they get ambushed. And from their perspective, they're like, this was a stupid training exercise. It was scripted. They actually don't know that you guys gave up your intelligence accidentally to a patriotic citizen, if you will, who then took the effort to get it to the resistance. Like completely not scripted. But now you can see, if you were a student, you start to see the power of this. And, the parallels that I got to see in my combat experience in Iraq are just, it's uncanny.
And I could see how that applies like anywhere dangerous, right? I mean, you hear stories. I was reading about, and there's someone we may have on this podcast soon who wrote a book about a particularly brutal prison riot. And there were cases of guards who were just kind, decent people who were basically told, don't come to work tomorrow. Like,
exact same thing.
By not being a jerk, you saved your own life. Like,
pretty much. And and the people involved are making a decision of, I'm going to assume a little bit of risk and get that message to those guys, because they assume it's either morally the right thing to do, or there's some benefit to me because I think these guys are helping us. I think it's better for the community. Everybody is applying their own mental calculus to this.
And I guess like a big picture question for you, because most of the people who read this book are not going to know a place like this. They're not going to be in the kind of circumstances where you worked and operated. What can people in a free, democratic, relatively safe society learn from a place where those to be fought and died over, like the way it sounds like they're kind of where, like without being oversimplistic, it sounds like they're kind of where the colonists were in the, George Washington's day.
Actually, for anybody who reads this, that's something I would love people to take away, if they don't already think this way, is, hey, the idea of, like, I'm going to say patriotism, it's not unique to America. Like the greatest degrees of patriotism I've ever seen are from Iraqis. A willingness to assume a degree of risk for no other reason than I want my son to have a better future than I had. I mean, there's some crazy stories like that. It's like, I think I would like to think the story helps people open up their perspective and their mind to these good characteristics of loving freedom, being willing to risk something to protect freedom and the rights of people, or having to make a decision that, if for people who are living in an oppressed society, at some point you have to take a stand, and that, again, it's part of the American history going back to our revolution, but it's you see it out in the world, and it's too easy to discount it as, why would we get involved in that? We shouldn't be, meddling. Sometimes we shouldn't be meddling in things, but sometimes legitimately there are very good moral reasons. And I'll go back to, I can't remember if it was on the recording, but you and I were talking about it. Bosnia, the issue of, hey, the horrors that happened in Bosnia happened over the course of 3 years. It should never have happened. At some point, there's got to be some moral intervention of, hey, we can't just let a society be destroyed by one side that thinks that's fine. And some people may disagree with that, but that's at least a perspective I saw on the ground and hope I convey in the book, that it's not a uniquely American characteristic to want to, protect your rights and freedom.
And I mean, you could even, like, you look at a couple 100 kilometers from where I'm sitting right now in Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, you had people where they were like risking their lives to try to get a sports team together that mixed the two sides, because they wanted their kids to have something to do besides hate each other.
Well, and there's another aspect to that too, because the way you just said that made me think of it. Most of the time, people in that environment, they're making a decision. Is it worth? Do I have a choice? Like, do I have to assume risk, or can I avoid this? If you live a fairly stable lifestyle, like you have a job, you have lots of stuff, you have your family is safe. The idea of these notions is ridiculous. Like, we should rise up because I don't like the government, or whatever it is, maybe. But if I take all of that away, I remove your job, the currency for the country has collapsed. It's of no value. There's no prospects for future. Your children have no chance of a decent future other than living in squalor or like a refugee. Iraq's kind of a funny case. And if I put piles of guns everywhere in the streets, you can't act surprised if now suddenly one community of people want to attack another community because they feel disenfranchised, or there's some degree of resentment. The best way to inoculate against that is not like fight each other. It's improve the conditions where it's the lifestyle of the people is too valuable to them to, it's a weird way that I'm explaining this, but like in the case of Iraq and in Kirkuk, which is the city that we seized in the north, one of the reasons it was particularly stable was because we restored basic governance services almost immediately. By luck, to some degree, we got electricity turned back on. That changed the entire dynamic in the city. Everyone was wanting to fight. Ethnically, groups didn't like each other. But when the power came back on, you could feel the city relaxed because now water's running, buses are running, people are selling stuff in the marketplace. It feels kind of normal. So the desire to fight and revolt wasn't really there in Kirkuk, the city we were dealing with. And then we made extra efforts to make sure the water was pumping correctly and clean, making sure, there's a whole bunch of stories in the book like this where the Kurds actually pushed 400 uniformed, unarmed police to man intersections because when the electricity was out, streetlights weren't working. So now imagine, it sounds ridiculous, but like people like in a white plastic helmet with like a road guard vest and a sash and spats on their shoes and white gloves are standing in intersections. And there's a mental aspect that everyone felt like, oh, well, I guess the rules still apply. There's a police officer in the street waving, you have to stop, you can go through. And it had a trickle down effect through the whole city that everyone was like, oh, the city's still functioning. The government is still here. And that's something the Kurds knew. Like we didn't tell them to do that. They did that instinctively. And like I said, it was great that they didn't send guys with guns to do it. They sent symbolic guys in weird uniforms that looked more like a parade uniform than a police officer.
That's amazing. I always find that really interesting how, like, I remember one time I was walking around. I have a brother who's, I would be willing to bet is a little older than you. My dad had me late in life, and that's a whole other story. But I was walking around New York with my brother, who's a journalist, and his beat was like covering a lot of just city stuff, including crime. And I was watching a guy like hand out those it was like a free newspaper kind of thing, and probably getting paid way below minimum wage to do that. And if he wasn't homeless, he was probably pretty close. And I was like, what? I said to my brother, I'm like, why wouldn't those guys just drop the pages like on some stoop somewhere, like all of them, and then just go have a beer or go about their day? And he's like, most people, you pay them to do a job, they try to do at least a halfway decent job because most people are pretty decent.
That's a great analogy.
It's one of those things I think, and maybe one of the unfortunate things about thinking that the world is like a dangerous place full of bad people or something, or that the world outside of your own country is somehow sinister.
Yeah.
That just basically isn't the case. I mean, that's another thing I liked about your book is it's essentially a travel guide for a place that doesn't have a lot of travel guides written about it.
And I'll use America as an example. Like, hey, look at America's history. America was a pretty scary place in 1860 and 1890. The Wild West. Like, we love to talk about the cowboy and Indian days and gunslingers. Like, the United States was a madhouse, in various pieces of our history. So I would love nothing more in my lifetime to hear about Iraq has become a great economy, great stable country, a great tourist destination, a leading nation in that region of the Middle East, because they really do have all, like, Afghanistan by comparison is incredibly challenged by their remoteness, but Iraq is not. Iraq has, a fantastic potential for tourism industry and has a fantastic potential for oil because of its economy, because of its oil. It can produce enough farm goods to feed the entire Middle East because of the land between the rivers. So it has, for religious tourism, for Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, it has all the dynamics to be a incredibly powerful and stable country. And I hope it achieves that in its future. And I hope that we don't forget that just because it doesn't maybe look stable at this time or now, the United States had the same problem throughout parts of our history where we were a mess at times.
Sure. You mentioned making choices, and, you obviously had the option to kind of get on with your life and just leave what you did, close that chapter and never speak of it. But you decided to write a book. I guess what motivated that and how did it go?
Well, yeah, no, that's a great question. I knew as soon as this operation was done, like, I think I joked in my head, like, hey, this should be a book, because I knew it was not normal. Like, it wasn't just the routine experience that, oh yeah, it's another good story. And there was a unique dynamic that I knew the whole story. Like, I was one of very, very few people that was there at the inception of the concept, the development of the plan, the preparation for the operation, and the execution of the operation. So, like, I have a very, very unique perspective. And when we were done with it, and by done, I mean the invasion part was done, we all ended up getting dispersed to different assignments. The U.S. military quickly got overwhelmed at, again, the devolving situation they weren't really prepared for. So they never really took a moment to talk about, hey, what just happened? And the story largely got lost, if you will. It wasn't that it was like secret or, some sensitive operation. I mean, to a degree it was, but it's more so it just got lost. So I knew, I've always said there's three reasons I wanted to write the book. One was I felt that the guys who conducted the operation deserved more recognition. And as a guy who knows the story, I know no one else can do this. No one else is going to write this book. So that was the first thing. I wanted to get, recognition for the guys who conducted the operation because I knew it was a really historic and successful operation. The second one was I knew the U.S. military needs to understand the story to add to the context of understanding the history of not just the war in Iraq, but what Special Forces does in support of the larger military and the good and the bad. It's not all good news, if you will. And then the third reason I wrote it was because I do think it's a great, entertaining, and amazing story that the population has. I'm not going to say has a right to know. Of course, they have a right to know, but they have a desire to know. They want to know what the military has done, things that I didn't know about, things that will make me proud of the military, if you will, I hope. So those were the real three components that I sat on for the better part of 20 years, but always retained. Like over time, I interviewed my former guys. Like I did interviews probably 15 years ago and held on to those interviews, knowing I'm going to write this someday. I collected maps. I collected random small documents. I kept a journal during the operation, which I kept my handwritten journal of, I knew what I did every day. So I could go back and say, hey, what was going on, March 15th. And then for whatever weird reason, about 3 years ago, I just decided to open my laptop and start writing one day. Because I kind of knew, it's that old thing, like, hey, it's going to take a really long time, but it's going to take even longer if you don't start. And I will say, I sat down and I timed out, like, okay, if I write, one chapter or two chapters, whatever my plan was, I timed it out. And I thought it would take me 2 years, and it took me 2 years. It was different. What took 2 years ended up being a little bit different, but the timeline was still about right.
Really funny. I tell people that it's like a rough draft is probably about a year, a book's 2 years, just if you're kind of going it alone. And it's very funny how that is kind of almost a constant for whatever reason. Yeah. But at the same time, if you were to write just a page every day, you'll have basically a book by the end of a year.
And that's the funniest experience of it all is the day that I said, let's just feel what let me, I did write an outline, that turned out to be pretty accurate. I adjusted over time, but it was pretty accurate. So I had a decent starting structural plan. And I was like, let me just write the first chapter and see what that feels like, what it looks like. And it looked like all first drafts. It was terrible, but that definitely got the ball rolling. And I went back and I edited it, had some help editing as well. And now I was like, okay, I can now start the second chapter and the third chapter. And, sure enough, that's how it all starts.
And I mean, it's worth pausing for like a public service announcement to keep a journal, people. If you're doing something that might make a good book one day, I've worked on books where the author kept a journal and had meticulous notes from the period of their life. And I've worked on ones where it's just memory, and the difference is unbelievable. Plus you can quote yourself, if you've got something where you captured it beautifully in your journal, it's right there.
Another experience I'll say is kind of amusing. I also made my list of who do I want to go interview. Because I was still in touch with a lot of my former guys, but I made the list of about 20 different guys, maybe 20 or 25 different people that I had to go find and interview. And I did. And, this sounds really stupid to say, but the difference between a bar story and a book, a bar story, if you don't get it quite right and you can't remember what happened, you can just kind of skip over it and fill it in. In a book, it needs to be accurate. And I did find out, talking to multiple guys, there were some gaps or inconsistencies in the story. John said he was on the left. Well, Tom said John wasn't there. I'm like, no, John was on the right. And had to go back multiple times, literally like sketching out a diagram of a specific battle or using a magnifying glass, looking at a very old map, trying to identify hilltop numbers, to make it all make sense. And looking back at it, it's kind of fun, but it was a meticulous research process before you could keep writing, if you will.
Sure. That kind of subjectivity reminds me a little bit of like the things they carried, where there are moments where he's like, this is how stories get exaggerated or whatever, because everything I just told you didn't happen. Like, this is, and I think it's, that can be really interesting to sometimes hang a lantern on and point out what.
That's a good point. for anybody maybe who hasn't done this and is thinking about it, like there's a tremendous, I felt a tremendous sense of, I don't know if responsibility is the right word, but like you've got to be accurate. You can't be like, and then I did this, and then I also did this, and then it's pretty amazing that I did this. Like, one, it's not about me, but I can't inflate anything. I can't conflate it. I need to get it right. And like I said, there's a couple of accounts in the book that are not super great for a couple of people. I deliberately chose to not use their name. Like I'm not trying to embarrass anybody, but I've got to tell the story accurately. And if I'm telling something that is not particularly, you didn't do a great job. I really made some efforts to confirm that with two, three, four other people and go, I don't want to make sure it's not my biased opinion. Is this accurate? Is this the same way you saw it? And, in every count I got, yeah, if I said something that was a bad example, I've gotten it from multiple other sources that they saw it the same way. But that's like that sense of responsibility. Like I can't accidentally write a book that just, brags about everything I want to brag about and says bad stuff about other people.
Sure. And it's funny because and I have this conversation with, it's one of the first things I like to talk about with authors, especially because humility comes up a lot. People generally want their book to capture their own humility, and it's a tricky one because saying how humble you are isn't humble, of course. But I think that talking about your own greatness or somebody else's flaws can actually have the opposite effect to what you think it's doing, where it actually sort of makes it look like you have something to hide. And then the reverse is true. I think talking about your own flaws makes you look real and human.
And that's exactly that tricky dynamic that you have to find the right balance for your writing. And like I say, because I do say this a lot when I'm talking about, I'm like, this is not a combat memoir. It's not the story of me. For a reader, yeah, you're gonna get introduced to me, but you know nothing about my background. I don't go into, I went to school here and I got commissioned. Like that's not relevant to the story.
And I meant to ask about that. Did you go into the Army knowing you wanted to do special forces, or did you find out about it once you were in the Army?
Yeah, and you're not really supposed to join as an officer. You're not supposed to join the Army because you can't go into special forces for a few years. You have to transfer. But I did know I was very interested in that. But I joined the Army in 1989 through ROTC. Like I went to college, I was in ROTC, got commissioned, became an infantry officer for 4 years, and then, raised my hand and said, hey, I'd like to try out for special forces. You go through the selection training course. You see if you get selected, and then you go into the training pipeline, as we call it. It takes about a year and a half. So that's how I became a special forces officer. But I will say this, I was just telling somebody this today. It all started with, I read a book about special forces when I was 15, and it just spoke to me. The way the guy wrote, author's name is J.C. Pollock. He wrote a book called Mission MIA about guys going back to Vietnam to find their friends that were held prisoner. And it's a fictional account, but it's based on he interviewed real special forces guys. And the dialogue and description of the camaraderie just resonated with me when I was 15. And as a part of me, that's the spark that started, I'd be interested in thinking about this down the road. And when I joined the Army, that's when I knew I had an opportunity to transfer.
Well, Dave Fielding called it the Adventure Plus package.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely.
I loved that description.
The biggest thing, if anybody's listening and they're like, I'd be interested in thinking about that. The biggest distinguisher that stops people is their own self-doubt. Like, yeah, there's plenty of hard things, physical events or whatever throughout the training. But the biggest thing that stops people is their own self-doubt. They would rather not try. They would rather quit than find out they're going to get told, no, you're not who we're looking for. That's the biggest distinguisher. Self-doubt's a scary thing.
And do you think that's why there is such, like, even if we're just going to judge a book by its cover really quick, it seems like there's such a variety of people who do your job? As far as like, you don't have to be a certain height. You don't have to be
absolutely
a physical specimen. I think one person told me the toughest people he knew in the military looked like bank managers.
Absolutely.
Is that because it's selecting for kind of intrinsic qualities that vary? Or
under good circumstances, if we're recruiting guys who are slightly older, like we're not looking for guys who, like, we do have a program where you can join the Army and come in, and it's called the X-ray program, but that's supposed to be a minority. The majority of our guys are supposed to have had at least one assignment in the Army, so they've had 4 or 5, maybe even 6 years in the Army. That previous life experience, like if you're getting a guy who's 28 to 32 years old, that's vastly different than getting a 22-year-old. And I cannot explain how much value we get from your goofball life experiences that we didn't train you in. I've seen guys who were transmission mechanics. I've seen guys who were former generator mechanics. I've seen guys who were former lawyers, and they pull these skills out, of their bag, so to speak. We didn't train them on that, but you're like, man, it's really great to have a guy. There was one guy in Iraq. He was a generator mechanic at a carnival in his previous life. And anytime we dealt with the Kurds and they had a generator problem, he's like, I can fix it. And besides the fact that they built tremendous rapport, like we also got the generator running. That life experience and having a diverse force that comes from different backgrounds is, in the book, I made not the analogy I mentioned before. We got a bunch of Kurds, none of them speak English. And one of the team leaders is a fluent Greek speaker because he's ethnically Greek. His family's Greek. And we find out one of the Kurds speaks Greek. And now we can translate, we can talk. So the diversity of backgrounds is one of our biggest strengths.
Yeah, that sounds very cool. And it sounds like some of that is almost antithetical to the expectations of the regular army.
It is. We really like to, for lack of a better term, have a diverse force with good experiences. We're not looking for a regimented, everybody standing next to each other looking exactly the same.
And then last thing, speaking of appearances, was in Kurdish culture, men, facial hair is a thing, right? When you grow a mustache or
mostly mustaches, yeah.
Did you folks grow mustaches to?
So I have a goatee now. I've had a goatee since I retired in 2012. But previous to that, I never had really facial hair. And I knew culturally most men have a mustache. It's an expectation. So back at Fort Carson, Colorado, when we knew, we were going, I started growing a mustache. Because, in my special forces background, I knew that's something I want to be able to blend in. If I have a mustache and I'm dealing with Kurdish gentlemen, there is a degree of rapport. I get a couple of bonus points if we look similar. It's a mental thing. But then there's also the aspect from 100 meters away, I want to look like them because if there's an enemy sniper, who is smart and knows, hey, killing the Americans is a good thing because the Americans are linked to air power and all sorts of other stuff. So if you look distinctly unique, it puts a bigger target on you. So there's an operational value to blending in. I'm not just doing it to be cool. But so back at Fort Carson, I'm growing a big mustache. Military guys, for the most American military, mustaches are not, it's frowned upon. It's not, I'm not going to tell you it's there's no regulation that says you can't have a mustache, but historically it's frowned upon. So as I'm growing a mustache, one of my commanders, the Colonel Cleveland, he'd see me walking around the area and he's like, that's quite a mustache you've got there. And I'm like, sir, this is your thing. I was like, sir, I hate having just a mustache. And I said, sir, do you want me to shave it? And he would say something like, no, I don't want you to shave it. And what he was implying, I want you to shave it. And finally, I will say there's 2 times I can grow facial hair very quickly. There's 2 times where I gave into peer pressure. And you also got to understand, we're frustrated. It feels like this invasion is not going to happen. Yesterday, there was a speech on TV and now I think it's off or it's not happening. So I'd shave my mustache. Literally the day I'd shave my mustache, it's back on. And, somebody would come in and whisper, hey, don't tell you I said this. Don't tell anybody I told you this, but we're going this weekend. Now, by the way, we didn't go this weekend. That nonsense went on for about 8 months. Somebody would leak the secret to me that it's going to be this weekend. So we stayed near your telephone every week for 8 months, and it was driving us all insane. So these periods where I'm frustrated with this. I'm shaving off my mustache. Then we'd hear, no, it's happening. I'd rush to grow my mustache back. So we played that game for quite a while. And I will say this, when we got on the ground, the day that I infiltrated, which was a few weeks before the war started, my boss, my counterpart and boss, Lieutenant Colonel Tovo, as soon as we got on the ground, one of the things he said to me was, he goes, call back to the guys back. The main body was still back in Romania. He said, call back to all the guys in Romania, tell them to all start growing mustaches, which I joked was yeah, you think? And everybody started, now we realize the value of, yeah, you're going to want to have a mustache if you come here.
Unreal.
This is stupid also. I'll say, when we liberated Kirkuk, now it was time to look like an American. And we all made very deliberate decisions to put on a typical American uniform, the desert fatigues, and shave my mustache because the American army is going to meet me. And honestly, like it's for the same reason I want to look like a Kurd when I'm dealing with the Kurds. There's benefit to looking like an American when I'm dealing with the Americans. And I also would prefer if they don't accidentally shoot me. So I shaved my mustache that night, came out of my wherever I was sleeping, and the Kurdish guys, the 5 or 6 Kurdish guys that I would deal with every day, had never seen me without a mustache. And as weird as it sounds to explain this, it would be the equivalent of if you were in high school and you shaved your head bald. Like they very juvenile high school, like they all broke into laughter, like, ha ha, look at you, you don't have a mustache. And and I played it up immediately. I grabbed my handheld radio and put it in front of my face like I was busy talking. And it was a moment of humor quite a bit, but it was funny to be like, ha ha, look, he doesn't have a mustache.
That's amazing. And that's like why I asked that question, because I knew there was a non-trivial story behind the mustache. Brilliant. Well, Mark, my favorite question to ask at the end of these is there anything you wanted to talk about that we didn't get into?
Sure. If we want to spend the next 6, 7 hours, I can take you through the whole thing. No, I appreciate it. We've covered tons of great stuff. I hope if people decide to read the book, they will enjoy it, because it has you and I. We've only touched on the tip of the iceberg of all the interesting specific human stories that are in the book. But I hope it's entertaining to people, and I hope it's also of value to people to help them think about that kind of complex situation a little differently, maybe.
I mean, I'm up for the 7-hour bonus episode on Mesopotamia, and now the only other thing, the title has kind of a special meaning to the Kurds.
Yeah, that's actually kind of funny because so the title is a translation of the term Peshmerga. Peshmerga is the Kurdish term for their guerrillas. So their guerrillas are called Peshmergas, and that translates to those who face death. And it was kind of funny because when I wrote this, I didn't know what the title of the book would be. I had a couple of different ideas that didn't pan out, and I'm glad I chose what I chose. But when we came up with the cover and the title, we sort of beta tested it on social media to see what people thought. And it got very, very good responses. But there was one guy that responded very snarky that said, and didn't understand the significance of it, and said something like, everybody who goes to war faces death. This is a stupid title. And I kind of laughed. I was like, no, you're not getting the point. I will just also submit, I don't disagree with that statement, but the degree that the guys in the book face death is a little bit different. So that's where the title comes from.
I mean, I love it. I have this theory about titles that the best titles sound good on their own, but then they mean more when you know what it's a reference to. And if that's something that's deeply embedded in the book, even better. The example I always give, the Blaze Foley song "Clay Pigeons," or John Prine covers it too, or Joni Mitchell's "Big Yellow Taxi." Yeah. Like "Big Yellow Taxi" isn't in the chorus of that song. It's not like the "Big Yellow Taxi" song. It's deep in the third verse, but it is the kind of satisfying conclusion of the entire thing. And I think that good titles work that way. And I mean, yours definitely
well
does.
And it speaks to, I'm also glad because the title is not about me again. It's about them. It's about, the Kurdish forces and the guys that were with them.
Well, Mark, where can listeners find you and find the book?
So the book has a homepage. You can Google thosewhofacedeath.com or Mark Grdovic, my name, with no spaces.com. It'll take you to the book's homepage, and it's available, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and it's also available in Audible, Kindle, and hardback and paperback.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for talking to me, and thank you for your service. Sounds a little trite. I'll say thank you for facing death. If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at dailyprose.com or on LinkedIn. My links and Mark's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.